Karpowicz from Poland, member of the Institute for the Study of Terrorism in Israel, Eviathar Ben-Zedeff, IDF military officer Adam Feder. Hello to all of you. I am the security philosopher and military historian, Dr. Uri Milstein, the host. We gather for an intercontinental Zoom conversation on the topic of Poland-Israel relations, past, present, and future. Professor Karpowicz, please open the dialogue.
First of all, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. Shalom to all of you. I am very grateful to Dr. Uri Milstein for the invitation. I am very grateful to other participants. Now, I have written 3 articles in Jerusalem Post related to Polish-Israeli relations. And the first one was in 2018. And I recommend to those who listen to us today that you also read the articles, because it is sometimes easier to express oneself in writing. One, of course, prepares a text for a longer time than to express everything at once in the spoken word. The first article, the title of the first article was Poland and the Jews, a few facts about Poland's World War II history. And in this article, I wanted to respond to some claims about the situation of Polish people during the Second World War. I was trying to show that, in a sense, we were both victims. The destruction of the Jews, of course, was a primary target for the Nazis. Nevertheless, we were also a target. So in a sense, one can say that we were, to some degree, fellow sufferers during the Second World War. And I am just describing in this article in details how it was actually, what were the mechanisms of destruction, of extinction of both Polish and the Jewish people. Like, for example, in terms of Polish people, the first target was Polish intelligentsia, which means Polish middle class. This is already what happened in 1939 when Polish intelligentsia is executed in a large numbers. Now, my family actually belonged, in a sense, to the Polish middle class, to Polish intelligentsia. So in a sense, this is also my family story. The story ends in the concentration camp. My mother and my mother's side of my family was in Hennigsdorf, next to Berlin, after the fall of the Warsaw Uprising, 1944. We had an uprising in Warsaw. My uncle participated and was killed. My mother, who was a child, was transported with the rest of the family to Hennigsdorf. If the war would last for maybe 2 or 3 months longer, I will not be born. So this is my article, Poland and the Jews, a few facts about Poland's World War history. Then the second article which I wrote was Poland's contribution to building Israel, because this is another important topic. Like my grandfather on the other side was part of so-called Anders Army. Anders Army was formed in the Soviet Union. Once Germany attacks Soviet Union, the Polish army is formed, but the army leaves Soviet Union, and actually it goes through the Middle East. My grandfather was also a part of this army, but he didn't come to Palestine because he was already an older officer. He was then transported to Africa. But the Anders army actually goes through Palestine. And then what happens? About 3,000 Jewish soldiers and officers, and the most famous one The most famous one is Menachem Begin, Prime Minister of Israel, future Prime Minister of Israel. He was also in the army. They desert, which means there are 3,000 desertions, but there is no single punishment for the desertion, even if many of them are discovered, yes? They are basically permitted. So this is another important part of our history, which should be better known, that the Anders army allowed about 3,000 fighters, Israeli fighters, to desert the army when the army was in Palestine. And of course, it was a contribution. It was a contribution to Haganah, to Irgun. It was a contribution to the freedom fighters in Israel, including, the distinguished fighter and politician whose name was Begin. Now, and recently, I also wrote an article. This was published in December. This was Israel and Poland as partners, the 800 years of common Jewish and Polish history. Now, all these articles are published in Jerusalem Post. Therefore, it is very easy to find them. You can simply write my name. My name is perhaps the most important to remember. Korab, K-O-R-A-B, /K-A-R-P-O-W-I-C-Z, Korab Karpowicz. If you write this name and then add Jerusalem Post, you will find my articles in Jerusalem Post. And I publish altogether 5 articles. I have published 5 articles, and 3 of them are about Polish-Jewish relationships. And in this last article, I summarize, in a sense, our history, because our history, in a sense, is 800 years old. It goes back to 13th century, because during the 13th century, there is the first, in a sense, mass immigration of Jewish people to the old Poland. This immigration is caused by persecutions, which actually occur in Europe at that time. Again, this is interesting to know about this history because Poland, sometimes people say Poland was the only country in Europe in which there was no religious wars. We didn't have religious wars, even if there were tensions, let's say, between Protestants and Catholics at a certain point, even if we were invaded by Sweden, which was Protestant in 17th century, we didn't have religious wars. Why? Because we formed a certain ethos, one can say. Country, a nation can form a certain ethos. And this was an ethos of tolerance. And maybe many of you could be surprised by what I say, because you don't know Poland from this particular aspect. But this can be historically proven, because otherwise, first of all, the Jewish community, which in a sense started to be established in Poland in 13th century, would not survive for so many hundreds of years, because as long as Poland was independent, and Poland was independent until the late of 18th century, then there were partitions of Poland. And then Poland was briefly independent during the period between 2 world wars. And of course, one can say Poland is independent right now. But I am now speaking about the old Poland. As long as Poland was independent, the Jewish community in Poland could enjoy certain privileges, certain rights, which would actually make, in the end, the Jewish community in Poland the largest community in the world. Because why such community, which would at the beginning of 19th century have around 1 million Jewish people? Why such big people, such big community could develop? It could only develop because of certain spirit of tolerance, because of the fact that in Poland we didn't have religious wars, because already in 13th century, actually in 14th century, in 14th century, the king Casimir I, he affirmed the rights which were initially given to the Jewish people in the late 13th century by so-called Prince Bolesław the Pious, and this was so-called Statute of Kalisz. So this is such a long tradition. Now, this is an introduction because, of course, we can dispute some facts. We can always have opinions. Sometimes those opinions may be different. We can even disagree on certain issues. But I would say like this. This is important to see certain facts, at least how someone from Poland looks at them. And then another thing which is very important, because we are now speaking about Jewish and Polish relationship, to find a certain common ground for the future. Because again, concerning opinions, we can always have some disagreements. We can dispute for a very long time historical facts. But the most important question which can be asked today is actually, what can we do together? What can we do together, and whether we want to do something together? And I would say to do something together is very important today. It's very important. I think it is as important today as it was in the past. Why? Because I think there is something common to both Poland and Israel today. And what is common, I would say, can be reduced to one word, and this word is security. We are concerned with our security in Poland, and you probably understand why, especially in today's situation. But I'm quite sure that Israel is also today concerned with its security. So if we can help each other, on a basis of certain tradition, on a basis of certain values, to improve mutually our security, I think this will be a great contribution from both of us.
I am Eviathar Ben-Zedeff, and I would like to mention that my family is from southeast Poland, near Zamość.
Yes.
And most of it was executed during World War II until June 42. And consequently, there is an ethos that goes in my family, all the survivors, that after the war gathered together either in the United States or in Israel, that is, let's say, very modestly anti-Polish. And this ethos is not confined only to my family, but also to a lot of Jewish people that came from Poland. We remember what Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir said about also was born in Poland, and he had a very, very nasty remark on the Poles and their relations to or attitude towards Jews. So you are right. If we Jews concerned only with the past, we had problems because, relatively speaking, we were not accepted worldwide. Therefore, we should be concerned with the future, the present and the future, and to try to build, I would not say new, but to build relationship, a positive relationship between the nations based on mutual interest and realpolitik. So in order to do that, we had to ignore remarks by stupid politicians that are abandoned, and to look forward and to see what are our goals and not be distracted by memories or stupidity. And as of now, Israeli-Polish relations are distracted by stupidity of politicians that I don't know why tried to create a conflict and to make the conflict harder and bitter. So the question, and we had a lot to forget, or let's say not forget, but to put aside, and in order to advance. We had to forget what happened during before, between the world wars, and then during World War II, and then during the communist regime. And I agree with you that to some extent, Jews and Poles are victims of vicious forces that govern Poland and East Europe. I don't compare between both suffering. It is not comparable. But I acknowledge that there is also, as a Jew, and as an Israeli, I acknowledge that the Poles also suffered. I didn't visit Poland, but I visited Hungary and Czechia, the Czech Republic, and the legacy of suffering during the communist regime is vivid down there. So how do we go further forward and create better relationship between Israel and Poland?
Mm-hmm.
Professor Karpowicz, please answer Eviathar.
You see, first, I know I have visited Israel. As you know, I was a visiting professor at the Hebrew University, and I am also an active person. So I would not only just spend my time in an office, I will walk I would walk on the streets of Jerusalem. I would speak with different people. And I know there is kind of among some people in Israel, there are some bitter attitudes towards Poland. And this comes from the past. I can understand the trauma which comes from the past. But let me just say two words, just very short time. I will tell you something about my family. My family, first of all, I have never heard in my family anything bad about Jews. So my mother or my father would never say anything bad about Jews. Now, my mother was born in 1931. She was born in Warsaw. Her father was a chemical engineer who was at the same time employed as a captain. He was a military officer as a captain in the Warsaw War School. So he was teaching basically chemistry and other subjects at the Warsaw War School. Now, 1939, 1st September, what happens? Now, such a person like my grandfather is the primary target for the Germans, an officer who is actually employed at the Warsaw War School. So he is primary target. So he changes his identity. He hides for the next 4 years. He just conceals himself as a simple worker. His son, which is my uncle, he actually graduates from the top high school. In Poland, there was Chyrów, very famous high school for the brightest student. And he's going to go to Oxford. He does not go to Oxford because he cannot go to Oxford because the war starts. And then he goes into the underground. He is part of the Polish resistance. And the family does not know anything about what he is doing, except they only know his second name, how he was actually called in the underground. Instead of being an elite student, in a sense, instead of going to Oxford, he's just fighting in the underground. At certain point, this is what my mother says, the uncle and herself being, the uncle is something like 19, she is 9. There is already the people in Warsaw already know there is a problem with Warsaw Ghetto. They start to help to deliver bread to ghetto, In 1944, the uncle dies and the whole family is shipped to the concentration camp. I said this already. Now, the second part of the family, which is my father's family. Again, my uncle is killed because he is also in the underground. My father is barely surviving because he goes out of the Soviet Union with the Anders army, but before he has actually received a death sentence from the Bolsheviks. So again, he is barely escaping death. Now, I come from the Polish family who survived, but I would say I'm a minority. Most of the people like myself, my grandfather's, second grandfather's profession was a lawyer. So again, the family, he just happened himself to be outside Poland because he was also a military officer. So you see, I survived. But I would say in most cases, families like my family have not survived. They have been killed. We have had a tremendous loss in Poland among the members of the middle class, of the Polish intelligentsia, so we have suffered also a lot. And then what happened next? 1945, the war is won against Nazi Germans, but then we have in Poland communism. So again, my family, my grandfather does not return to Poland before the year. Now, the first grandfather, he just dies in 1946. Why he dies? Because he actually learns that his son, which is my uncle, died during the Warsaw Uprising. He didn't know about this. He got the message in 1946, and a few days later, he has heart attack and he dies. Now, the second grandfather, who was with Anders' army, he comes to Africa, but he does not return to Poland before the year 1949, because he thinks that he could be endangered. He finally decides to go back to in 1949, but he can no longer exercise his profession of a lawyer. He was a judge, a lawyer in the pre-war Poland. He no longer can be a lawyer. He does not return to the same city. He settles down in a city which is about 600 kilometers away from the city where he lived before the Second World War, because he is still afraid of his life, You see, so we could, of course, tell our stories. They were also terrible. But what we need to do, if we want to deal with history, we should properly determine our enemies. We cannot mislead ourselves who was actually the author and who was the enemy. We didn't cause the Second World War. We didn't cause all this, what happened to Poland during the Second World War. We could be responsible what would happen before Second World War. For this, we could be responsible. Whenever we have a Polish government, then we can say, here, Poland is responsible because they had a government and the government has not prevented something. For this, we can be responsible, but we cannot be responsible for a situation when we are ourselves endangered in our lives. So I think this is very important, of course, to look towards the future. This is how I was educated, in a sense, as a person. I was always told by my family, look, this is our history, but please look towards the future. We don't want that this history repeats itself. Do everything, in a sense, as you can to promote a better, the better future for all of us, for humankind. In a sense, this is why in the end, after being educated as an engineer, I turned to be a political philosopher. And this is what I am doing, in a sense. All my books or my articles are, in a sense, related to the need to work for a better future of humanity. Actually, this is one of my books, this is Tractatus Politico-Philosophicus, New Direction for the Future Development of Humankind, New Directions for the Future Development of Humankind. So I would say this is my greatest work. So this is what I was, in a sense, told by my parents, by my family. Look, this is what we have experienced was terrible, but let us just build a future. Now, for me, a bit tragic, what is that I see now, in a sense, kind of a return to the past. In a sense, this security situation, which is now in the world, for me somehow is something what contradicts the vision of the future my family had. My family would never thought probably that we could again think about another world war, about the third world war or something. This is for me, in a sense, a bit tragic that we are already, in a sense, aiming in such a direction, which I feel is not right. It's not right. But another thing, when we speak about Polish-Israeli relationships, as we lived, in a sense, together for 800 years, even if we are not similar, even if we are different, I believe we have adopted certain common values. This is very important also to know. And I think to a large degree, and this is again something what maybe it's not known in Israel, the Israeli military has adopted Poland's military ethos, because again, Poland is not in an easy place in the world. Poland had probably more wars in the history of the 1,000 years of Poland's history. You would have more wars than probably of any European country. So as we develop as a society, as a country, we have learned certain skills. And one of them is Poland's military ethos. And all those good qualities, which when I was at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, I had most of my students were actually from the army. They were just young people who already had military service. I think 2 or 3 were still active. And they were telling me how they are trained, what are the values which are given to them. And I would say those values, those are maybe not today's Poland's values, because I think Poland today has lost some of its traditional ethos, but those are the old Poland's, in a sense, patriotic, courageous values. So if we look, I think, what we should do to improve Poland's Israeli relationships, we should not be completely indifferent to history. Even if it is difficult, we should not be completely indifferent to history. We should, first of all, explain the history so people understand this better. How can we, for example, be anti-Semitic if we have hosted the Jewish community for many hundreds of years, and this community would flourish? So in a sense, this contradicts the facts. We cannot be totally anti-Semitic. Maybe we are a little bit, how are we? This should be, in a sense, discussed, discovered, but certainly there is also a lot of philo-Semitism. Otherwise, the Jews would never be able to build such a strong community, such a strong culture as it was in the past. Then second point, there are certain values. What are the values of Polish people in general? We are very patriotic, at least we were, everything is changing. But, part of our ethos is being patriotic. It is being brave. It is we were actually the first country which confronted Nazi Germany on 1st of September, knowing that we could not really win. We have counted on the British help. This is our weakness. We are a bit politically naive. So in a sense, we were a bit politically naive by entering into the war against Nazi Germany. Nevertheless, we were brave and we were fighting bravely. We would not give up. We would then fight in the Western Front, then in Eastern Front. We would fight everywhere against Nazi Germany. So this says something about the nation, And I think those are also some values which I have discovered myself when I was in Israel. My impression my impression of the Israeli students were very positive. I believe they had many good values in themselves, which I would recognize as common values. So the second level on which one could build relationships, first of all, history should be clarified. We should be, the people in Israel, Jewish people in general, should learn that we are not as bad as you sometimes think we are. You know, if we were so bad, you would never be able to form such a strong community in Poland and to develop Polish Jewish culture in Poland. The second point is to discover some common values, which is very important. And the third level is actually to look towards the future, because in general, I would say, this should be important for all of us, not only for the people in Poland, not only for people in Israel. We don't want to have a third world war, you know. What would be the benefit for all of us? You know, what would be the benefit for humanity? So we should, in a sense, stop those crazy politicians who suggest such solutions. We should be prepared again to sit at diplomatic tables, and we should look at solutions which will promote which would promote peace. Why? Because it is not only important for our lives, it is also important for the development of our civilization, for the development of science and technology, and so on. There will be no benefit whatsoever if another disaster, which will not take 60 million lives, like the Second World War, but probably 600 millions of lives, or even more. Some people suggest that if Third World War would happen, we will lose half of the global population. What would be the benefit? And I see no benefit in it at all. Why are we not able to solve some basic problems which are to be solved at the table? But we need to be open for a debate. We need to be open for honesty, for a frank conversation with each other. So what I propose, you know, I am a professor. I am not a Polish ambassador to Israel. In fact, I propose this to my government, but for the time being, my government does not listen. I don't know whom they will send to Israel. But I made this official proposal. Yes, we will see. We will see. But what I would do, I would operate on those three levels, which means on the level of clarification of history, at the level of finding some common values and reinforcing them if they are positive, and then working together for peace and security, which is very important.